Hi, Russ of Aquarimax here. Today's video is a species profile of a variable and often beautiful isopod, Porcellio ornatus. After an introduction to the species and a few of its many localities and morphs, I'll delve into its care and housing needs, and then discuss its potential as a member of a bioactive cleanup crew, and finally evaluate the species as a pet or hobby isopod. Porcellio ornatus, as the name implies, can be quite beautiful. It has a number of geographical variants or localities, as well as some cultivated morphs. Compared to the number of localities that exist in their native Spain, only a few of these are widely available in the US hobby yet, and that's probably true of many parts of the world, but that will likely change in the future. It's a moderately large, somewhat thin, elongate isopod. It's about an inch long, which is about 2.5 centimeters. I currently have 3 forms of this species. My newest is Porcellio ornatus nord, or north. These fantastic markings make it look a lot like Porcellio hazai. I recently got these from Smugbug, and I'm looking forward to offspring soon. The first form of Porcellio ornatus that I ever kept came from Wally at Supreme Gecko. This locality is known as P. ornatus yellow dot, or gold dot, or south, and a number of other names. This isn't exactly a flashy locality, but the little splashes of color to the rear of the perion and on the pleon are kind of fun. Probably the most visually striking morph I have is P. ornatus high yellow. From what I understand, it's been line bred from a naturally occurring yellow locality for more coverage of yellow markings. The markings are quite variable, but the yellow in mature specimens against the dark gray is just beautiful. Younger specimens are not nearly as bright as the adults, though. Smugbug gave me permission to use some pictures of other localities and morphs that I don't currently have. Let's take a look at those. Here is a popular morph based on the high yellow called chocolate high yellow, which has a brownish background color, as you can see, instead of gray. It's definitely a good looking isopod, but in my opinion, the yellow on dark gray is just a little more striking. Porcellio ornatus white skirt is a lot like yellow dot, but not surprisingly, it's adorned with a white skirt. Smugbug has also been working on some interesting morphs. Here is a fascinating Dalmatian version of Porcellio ornatus high yellow. I really like the tricolor effect. Another marvelous mutation that Smugbug is working on is a tyrosinase negative albino morph of P. ornatus nord called lemon sorbet. I think the name is very appropriate. Thank you again to Smugbug for sharing these pictures. By the way, if you haven't visited smugbug.com yet, I highly recommend them as an excellent source for isopods and supplies. And if you've worked with Smugbug before, leave a comment below telling us about your experience so everyone else can know how great they are. Before I go on talking about the care requirements for this species, I'd like to recognize my patrons at Patreon. Your support helps me make more videos about interesting creatures to share with everyone, and I think you're amazing. If you'd like to contribute for as little as $1 a month, please check out the link at the end of this video. And my thanks to all of you, just watching my videos, using the affiliate links in the description, shopping at the Aquarimax website, or just watching all my videos. All of those have a positive impact. Now, let's discuss care and housing requirements for Porcellio ornatus. If you want to get started keeping some of the larger Mediterranean isopod species, this is one of the hardier species in that group, so it's a pretty good one to start with. Specific requirements do vary from locality to locality, but in general the species does well with a strong moisture gradient. In other words, though it absolutely needs a damp hydration station in a small part of the enclosure, it thrives if most of the enclosure, maybe about 2/3 to 3/4 of the enclosure, is kept quite dry. This species benefits from ventilation. Exactly how much depends partly on the locality and partly on conditions within your home. I've successfully bred the yellow dot morph with big sections of screen in the lid. My Porcellio ornatus high yellow are breeding well just with these holes drilled along the top and sides for ventilation. According to an experience recorded by Orin McMonigle, it's possible to provide too much ventilation to the high yellows. See his book on isopod zoology for more information. There's a link in the description. Several pieces of bark, including some concave pieces so that the isopods can rest in a spot some distance from the substrate, will be helpful. You'll also need to keep the size of the enclosure in mind. A 6-quart tub is fine to start with if you're starting with a fairly small group of isopods, but they do get pretty big, and as your culture grows, you'll probably want to upgrade to a 16-quart tub at least. In my experience, this isopod species is a voracious feeder. If you've seen my video on hand feeding isopods, this was one of the species that I found very easy to feed by hand. It will feast upon almost anything you could offer to isopods. See my video on feeding for more specifics. This species definitely appreciates protein. It absolutely devours fish food pellets, but it will also eagerly eat vegetable food. Cuttlebone is consumed with apparent enthusiasm as well. I have found P. ornatus yellow dot very simple to breed. When Wally at Supreme Gecko sent me some a few years ago, it wasn't long before I had a pretty large colony. Porcellio ornatus high yellow doesn't seem quite as prolific, but mine are certainly breeding well for me. I have several clutches of various sizes of juveniles in the enclosure. Orin McMonigle mentioned in his book that this species, in contrast to many, if not most isopods in the hobby, doesn't really breed very readily until it is at or near adult size. I've observed the same thing with my colonies so far. I've only been keeping P. ornatus nord for a relatively short time, so I haven't seen any offspring yet. But the individuals are approaching adult size, so I don't think it'll be long. So now, let's address whether or not this species would make a good member of a bioactive cleanup crew. Considering its requirements for a dry area, as we discussed before, some might consider this species a good candidate for a semi-arid to arid vivarium, but I advise caution. As I said, this species is quite attracted to protein, and as you may have seen in some of my other videos, they will readily climb onto my hands to nibble at my skin. Though this doesn't do me any harm, I have concerns that a group of hungry P. ornatus might overwhelm some sensitive species of reptile or invertebrate. I don't have any personal experience using this species as a cleanup crew, so until more data is available, I don't recommend using it. And finally, let's evaluate this species as a hobby isopod. First, let's talk about the advantages of this species as a pet. Porcellio ornatus is moderately large, though not quite as large as the largest of the Mediterranean Porcellio species like Porcellio hoffmannseggi or Porcellio expansus. As long as it's maintained with a good moisture gradient and good ventilation, it does tend to be pretty easy to keep. My Porcellio ornatus yellow dot are also extremely bold and active and not particularly shy in daylight. And as my colonies grow, I expect my high yellow and nord to behave similarly. Many of the localities are quite beautifully marked as well. That seems pretty hard to beat as a display isopod. There are various localities and morphs in their native Spain, and while not all of them are widely available in the hobby, a good number are, with more in development. The major downside of this species is the somewhat less hardy nature of the high yellow and possibly other morphs or localities compared with the yellow dot. They do all seem to like fairly similar conditions, but the high yellow seems to be just a little more sensitive. As I believe I mentioned before, different localities seem to vary somewhat in their environmental preferences. So if you're looking at obtaining a specific locality, definitely make sure to research its specific needs. But all in all, if you're looking for an active, fairly hardy display species with a good deal of variety, which will also help you become familiar with the requirements of the larger Mediterranean Porcellio species, this is a great species for you. I'm planning on doing mini isopod species profiles. Which isopod species would you like to see me feature next? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching today. I post videos every Tuesday and Friday, all on aquarium and vivarium pets, with lots of isopod content. Feel free to share, rate, comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe. And then tap the bell so you don't miss my next video. It's funny how this can happen. The day that I recorded the narration for this video, I checked on my Porcellio ornatus nord right afterwards and noticed that there were tiny babies. They're a little bit too old to properly be called monkai, I think, but it's just kind of a fun coincidence.